Hello, everyone, and welcome back as we continue with our chapter on the Industrial Revolution. So please title your notes for today, How to Make a Killing in Big Business. As a key outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution, we're going to end up with new economic principles really being thought up and created, namely among them being capitalism, which we know all too well today, being a fundamental economic idea in the United States where we live. So today we'll be talking about what capitalism originally was, how it was intended to function, and then going forward we'll talk about other philosophies like utopianism, utilitarianism, socialism, and communism. So just to begin, we need to talk about the growth of what are called corporations. So these are big businesses that require quite a lot of money to run. Typically, what would happen is an entrepreneur or someone who finances themselves in their own company sells shares or stocks in a business. A stock is like a partial ownership. So basically, if you own a stock, you own part of the business. It's typically a very, very small portion of the business. But anytime the corporation or the company starts to do better, your investment would grow. And every time that the corporation or business does worse, your investment would shrink. So corporations are basically businesses that are owned by stockholders. And the two most notable in the US at the time were Carnegie Steel and Rockefeller Standard Oil. Think about it logically, what major industry was emerging during the time? Transportation, namely being locomotives, trains. You need steel to actually lay down the railroad tracks and build the actual trains themselves, and then Standard Oil for them to run. So here we have Andrew Carnegie. He's typically cited as like the quintessential example of like a philanthropist or someone who donated a lot of his wealth. His primary sources stemming from him are oftentimes cited, and how this time period fostered equality or opportunities for people to make money. On the flip side, we have John Rockefeller, who's typically on the other side of the spectrum, also a business titan, basically just running his business in a very different way, typically to drive other people out of business and monopolize the industry of oil. There are two basic production methods that emerged during this time that you'll be exploring in a lot more detail next year in U.S. history. One, at the very end of the school year, once you get to the Gilded Age. But on the left-hand side, you see vertical integration. And this is basically where a business controls the whole process of production. So you can see here in meatpacking, it goes from the cattle to the slaughterhouse where they're killed, to the refrigerator trucks, to the warehouses, to the delivery. It's all part of the same business. On the flip side, you have horizontal integration, where a business is horizontally designed, where you're really controlling one portion of that production line, but you're monopolizing it and you're making, the profit on that portion. So Rockefeller's industry was locomotives, trains for the most part, but on that, line, his company was oil. So every, small independent company would rely on him to provide the Standard Oil they needed for their product. So I want to just take a moment to take a look at some popular political cartoons from this time period. They're enormously good at showcasing what was going on. Here you can see just how powerful these trusts or these massive businesses became. You can see the entrance for the monopolists on the far right-hand side. You can see, obviously, the famous saying for the Senate changed to be all about the monopolists wielding all the power, as they're kind of looking down on the senators in the Senate chamber who are not really having that much control, but rather yielding their control to these massive industries, these groups who are giving them money to finance their campaigns. And then in return, they pass legislation that allows these trusts to do as they wish. And then the people's entrance in the top left-hand corner is shut down so that the people really don't have access to their own government. Here you are seeing Standard Oil depicted as an octopus with its tentacles basically around everything in life, around workers, around the White House, the Capitol building. All elements of the world are basically controlled and owned by Standard Oil. And here, this is a good depiction about the beginning of labor unions and how you can see a worker has really nothing to protect itself against the power and might of the monopoly. You can see like these government-looking officials or these wealthy capitalists over here on the side looking on as a representative of the poor or the working class basically is going to be destroyed by what capitalism is here. You can see his feathers as arrogance. He's obviously driving this massive golden horse that's representing a locomotive. He, on the other hand, has really no power. His only power that he really has is to strike. And we'll talk about labor unions and how striking was really used as an effective tool by them during this time. So, in terms of the impact of industrializing, we have a maximizing of production of raw materials. And this is going to be significant, and I want you to star this in your notes and make sure that you understand this. Because we need these raw materials for production, countries turn toward what's called imperialism, or conquering foreign lands, taking colonies, and then extracting these resources from them. This is going to be the next chapter in our course. During this time, just as a very quick side note, the ruler of England is Queen Victoria. It's typically called the Victorian period, very different than England has been in the past. And we'll be talking about Queen Victoria a lot going forward. So to kind of bookend this, concept of industrializing and the machinery aspect of the chapter, we have the creation of what's been called the Crystal Palace Exhibition. And this is taking place in Victorian England. It's basically a massive museum of achievements from all across the world, showcasing what industrialization has created. There are guns, there are artifacts, instruments, factory equipment, etc., all really demonstrating what has been achieved in only the past few years. One thing that's really important to understand is that prior to the Industrial Revolution, basically your life was the same whether you lived in the 3rd century or the 8th century or the 12th century. And then by the time you get to the 18th century, the 1700s, these machines fundamentally transform what people are capable of. You can travel, you can get materials from far away, you can visit foreign relatives, you can travel to different parts of your continent. It just fundamentally transforms life all around the world, and the Crystal Palace really is a demonstration of what's changed. You can see here, this is how massive the palace became, a massive attraction and museum for people all across Europe. And similar exhibitions were created in other parts of the world as well, but most notably, the one in London was the most popular. And this is the interior. You can see the flags of all the countries of the world and all of the achievements in it. One important thing to note about the Crystal Palace is the feeling that it gave people as they entered. It was basically like a massive greenhouse with all this machinery and industrialized equipment inside of it. And it carried a lot of symbolism too, because it had like these two worlds colliding with one another. The world of nature, the world of the past, the trees and the flowers, while also having all of this machinery and equipment from the modern age at the time that seemed almost something out of like a modern day science fiction movie to these people. And it also kind of gave the feeling of, an ending. Like people looked at this equipment and they couldn't imagine where else they could go from there. Of course, living in the internet age, we know that over the past few years, we've moved faster than ever. But being in there was an eerie feeling that a human society really had reached its conclusion, and this was the furthest that it could ever progress. So, to end off for today, we're going to talk about our first economic philosophy, which is capitalism. And capitalism really prioritizes the concept of laissez-faire, or it translates from French to let do. And the idea is that there is no government regulation whatsoever. So businesses do as they please, and the idea is that they're going to self-regulate each other, so that through competition, businesses will pay a fair wage to their workers. They will make better merchandise because they're going to want people to buy their products, and that there really is no need for government regulation because they'll kind of take care of themselves. Adam Smith is the father of capitalism, and he argues that government really just slows production and hurts a nation's economy. In 1776, he writes a famous work called The Wealth of Nations, which basically becomes like the quintessential Bible of capitalism and like guide to how capitalism is supposed to function. Just taking a look in The Wealth of Nations, which you read several excerpts of in class, there are three basic principles that are included. Number one is social interest, that people work for their own benefit. Nobody is working for pure benevolence. There has to be some incentive to work or to create these businesses if they're going to be successful. Number two is competition. That competition forces people to make better products, pay their workers more. Like Adam Smith would disagree with things like unions and striking and labor contracts, because the idea would be if you're not happy in your job, quit. And then if businesses can't find the right employees, they will change their conditions to bring in these employees to work for them. Number three is supply and demand. So the number of goods produced and their cost are based on the demand for those goods. So if something is like very desired, it becomes more expensive, more profitable. And if something is more in abundance or less desirable, it becomes less money. A key part of understanding capitalism is what's called the boom-bust cycle. And every economy in the world kind of follows these trends where basically there's a peak, things are going really well, and then there's a recession. And then it goes down, there's a trough, and then there's a recovery. There's a peak, a recession, a trough, recovery, and it kind of follows this trend. Usually every decade or every 2 or 3 decades, we see something like this, and it's usually triggered by something that happens. In the case of the Great Depression, the recession was really caused by a boom in the stock market and then a collapse when people were buying stocks with money that they really didn't have. In 2008, during the Great Recession, it was a housing bubble. People were taking out mortgages they ultimately couldn't pay back. So that's kind of like the trend that it ultimately follows. But the key thing to understand in capitalism is that the market is supposed to self-correct. So the government's not supposed to step in. If there is a recession and things aren't going well, the idea is that businesses will self-correct over time. They'll figure out why things are down. They'll readjust their products. They'll change how they pay their workers, and then the recovery will take place naturally. On the flip side, like during the Great Depression, as years are passing and people are not doing any better, they want government interference. And really, since the Great Depression, we've always seen like stimulus packages and the government stepping in to make people's lives better during recessions because people can't wait for the natural recovery to take place. This chart just very quickly showcases the idea of supply and demand. If something is in more abundance or is less desired, obviously the price goes down. If something is more rare or something is more desired, the price goes up. In our future lessons, we'll talk about the growing desire for other policies like communism and socialism, as many of these workers end up in conditions that are extremely poor, bad working hours, not a lot of pay, and you'll see that these other economic philosophies become very alluring to them.